thank you for all participants who's actually taking out of your valuable days to join and discuss this, because I think we are at discussion to action stage in this topic. So my ambition here is to inspire some insight, but to increase reflection and motivate action. And I'm going to do that by sharing a bit around the business's climate progress. I'm going to give example of good board practices. What I want to do here is to encourage everybody to actually add your perspective of good board practices in the chat, so we get a bit of a discussion. And then I'm going to end up with some tips on resources. I have to say, though, sitting on boards, I think most of us will realize that we are in absolute increased uncertainty. The level of uncertainty have never been as big as it is right now. Neither has the pace of change. And what we're experiencing is actually a very complex system change, where the climate topic is very, very important, but can easily disappear amongst everything else we're trying to handle. So there is a bit of lack of clarity on how to engage and how to take accountability from different actors, including owners, including boards, including companies and MDs. So the key thing to understand here is that very often owners and chairs and MDs underestimate how instrumental they are. It's very easy to put it to EU or to put it to government, but this is actually going to be very, very important that our group of stakeholders here look at that. I'm going to share with you something you can actually pick up afterwards. And this is a set of principles on how to guide climate governance for corporate boards. And it includes principles, it includes questions and guidance. And it's divided into 8 principles, which cover 4 areas. The first is around the board's role itself. So how do we take accountability? What do we know, and how do we structure our work? The next area, which is really the key area, is how do we consider the risk, but as well the opportunity, and how do we get it into the strategic integration? The next area, which is a lot of discussion around, is of course around the how do we put out objectives, how do we report, and how do we incentivize for impact? And the final area is how do we collaborate with stakeholders for our businesses? So if I start with principle 1, it's the accountability topic. And I will share some progress data, which we are taking from TCFD. So it's about 1,400 plus companies, and that was researched last year. And we want you just to reflect on that. If you want to have more local data, we actually have a lot of local data at Boards Impact Forum. And you will see there a bit more around where the Nordics are as well. So on governance, in average, we are improving. But this is more reflecting on where we are. So how clear are we about the board oversight and the management role? And you can see that we're improving, but it's still from a low level. The other thing which is very important is to see how much this actually differs across industries. So banking, which of course has entered this much earlier because of the regulation, has put in more measures. And then you get into the energy, which is very much the core of the challenge. So of course they have started. The challenge you can see very clearly is, for instance, tech and media, which is very low, but is very dependent that the tech and media organizations actually do identify a lot of the transition offerings that can help the other industries. So the other thing that we know is that the larger companies can obviously put in a bit more resources and are a bit more ahead on this. And the smaller the companies, we know that in average it's lower, but in all of these, I would say that as much as you can see the difference between industries or sizes, you can see within every segment. So within small companies, you really have companies that are fully aligned. So that's another thing to think about. Now on the I'm getting into good board practices, and we look forward to see your examples. So one thing we know is that board members need to discuss. They need to assess their own view and find a common ground to actually put it on the agenda and discuss. And here we're showing an example where you can actually go in and do an evaluation for your own board or leadership team and find out where you are. Very easy. The other thing we know is very important is, what is the trigger point of starting? So obviously a major change that has happened in Europe is due to the dependence of Russia and the sanctions. That has really pushed over. But what are other trigger points that you can actually drive for? Well, one very good trigger point is to question how many of the key customers you have committed to science-based targets, and get that as a base for discussion. You can also clarify your own position versus the industry. And obviously the current regulation is going around clarifying the percentage of revenue and OPEX and CAPEX that you have if you are in the target group and listed. The challenge in that is that there's so many little nudges and rules that you will start with ending up quite low for many. And don't be discouraged about that, because it's still a very important drive. So the other thing we know is that it's very important if the chair take a proactive leadership role to include climate and ESG. And this is an example from Jim Hagemann-Snabe, which is now the chair of Siemens and soon to be the chair of Northvolt. And the other thing we know is that it's very important that to include in your board evaluation, how are you treating this new subject and how do you engage with that? And I discussed yesterday with Aya, and I know that you have a board evaluation that do include that at Boardman. So the second principle is actually what you know. One of the things that we know is that when board actually do joint education together with the management team, we know that the discussion about the impact starts much earlier. We also know that if the MD and the chair leads that discussion, it has a very big impact. The other thing, of course, if you add people with more competence to the boards, but we also know that the boards can ask to make sure that the sustainability officer is part of the top team, which is not necessarily so in many companies, and to ask to meet with the company sustainability officer. So in the board structure, there's a lot of discussions around, should we have it as intervention points? Should we have this as part of different committees? The most important topic is that you have a clarity between board and management, what your roles are, and that you clarify which committees is responsible for what. We have, however, done a really interesting little assessment, and that is for some of our leading companies in terms of sustainability, what committees do they have? And as is normal, they all have nomination, remuneration, and audit and risk committees. The interesting thing is actually quite few have sustainability committees because they are already on the innovation and transform path. And there they are putting in a committee to actually help drive the transformation. Principle 4, it's really about the risk and opportunity assessment. And here we can see that the assessment process is improving, but still also from low levels. In terms of strategy, there's some really interesting progress in terms of risk and opportunities, but we still have a bit of a challenge on actually making the strategy also resilient. So in terms of looking at good board practices, one of the things we know is that board members that ensure that you actually work both with management but also board in workshops when you actually look at the risk map has a much bigger impact, that you don't just stamp it as it comes into the board and somebody has done a research topic on it. So that is one area. The other area is to make sure that you actually include not just financial risk and operational risk, but also the strategic risks, and that you try to have that in the same map. And the final thing is that you make sure that you actually look at what we would call scope 3, which is not what is used or produced by the company itself, but it's something that is used by your suppliers that you have to use. And in fact, if you look at the area of scope 3, the average of scope 3 is that for most companies, 80% is in scope 3 of the challenge, which actually means that many companies risk of saying, it's not my problem. I only have 20%.
Liselott,
the rest, somebody else.
Liselott, would you please go once again through scope 1, 2, and 3 in case there are people who doesn't know about those?
Right, and maybe Heli or somebody can put it, or you even can put it in the chat. But scope 1 is really what you consume when you produce your own products and services. The scope 2 is what you use in terms of your facilities and the energy you consume in that. And scope 3 is what you have with your suppliers and your customers, and how they are actually consuming, which means that this is a value chain problem, and it's very easy to always say it's somebody else's problem, but that is not how you will either find the risk nor actually find the opportunities. And we'll come back to that. The other thing we know is that if the boards put a bit of effort and not just identify the risk and the approach to mitigate that, but actually also put efforts into what opportunities do you find out of the risks that you identify, you will actually also be much further and quicker on. The interesting thing that we also find is that it's actually easier to get the boards to engage in those discussions. So the strategic integration, this is an example from Maersk. And one of the things that you can see is that if the board manages to truly get it into the business strategy and have it as core parts of its its strategy, it facilitates the investments decisions, it facilitates the structure and the discussion to actually move forward. So the boards that ensures the strategy integration, and it can be expressed as ESG, as in this case, Maersk have done it. So they have clearly identified where their commitment stands in terms of both the environment and social and governance areas. And this is public information, so you can just look at their website. The principle 6 is about incentivization. The only balance we would put here is that in Nordics, we usually have a bit of broader way to look at how do we motivate people and incent people. The other thing I think it's worth noting is that the approach to incentivize even CEOs is very different across the Nordic region. So it's just good to think about where is the different areas and how do you build what in. But in Nordic, we can find that if you find a way to include part of the ESG in short term, but also make sure that some of it, especially on the environment and climate side, is really targeted in long-term incentives, that has a better focus. But the key thing is also to recognize a much broader motivation. How is the board role modeling? How are they talking about it? How do they talk about the importance and type of mission their company is on? So what kind of engagement does it give you if you are part of such a mission to actually be part of other similar missions? Can you start to become part of a club that is driving? That is important also, can we see, for the Nordic leadership teams. When it comes to principle 7, it's about reporting and disclosure. And we have had, for the listed companies specifically, some kind of climate-related metrics going on for a while. We are improving in the broader scope 3, and we are also increasing our commitments on targets. One of the things we know from here, and that's clear also from some of the questions, is that you cannot just sit and look at legislation and have that drive your business. You really need to establish your own key metrics from your own assessment on the objectives and the metrics that you want to drive this along. And make sure that you actually look at the materiality map, bring that in, but also consider commitments. And of course, because of the legislation, you will be requested for assurance going further. But right now, you can also look for assurance for some of the topics that is quite complex. I think this example, which we just continued from Maersk, is quite interesting because you can see that they're finding a balance to look at commitments on both different areas, but also look at the timing of commitments. So where should we be at 2030? Where should we be at 2040? Principle 8, which is exchange, which is about maintaining the exchanges with peers, with policymakers, investors, of course, customers, stakeholders, employees, etc. So one of the things, this is from our own Nordic research, one of the things we know from there is that many companies do engage with their stakeholders, but it's not very formalized on how it's handled, and therefore not necessarily so that you drive it. And this is just a good way to think about that. You actually start to think about how do you dare to prioritize? So how do you actually find a way on which stakeholders have both the highest interest and the highest influence, and try to align mostly with that and then go from there? Then in exchange, this goes to the scope 3 discussion, but this is actually something that everybody that works in a smaller business can actually use directly. And you can guide your own suppliers, which might be smaller and medium businesses, to find a way to look at where they are and look at how they can work with you to commit. And again, if you see all of the legislation, all of the different things coming, it's very hard for a smaller business to even understand where you are if you're not founded to be an impact company, but if you're a more traditional company. So one of the areas we recommend is something called the SME Climate Hub, where you can actually, in a very simple, very quick way, less than 10 minutes, figure out where do you stand in general. And it's not into details, but it gives you a first impression on where you are. And you can compare later on where you are compared to the industry. Then you can have a very good discussion with them on where are they and how can they, or you, if you're an SME, commit. And how can you then learn and plan and act? And how can you actually formalize even a bit of network for your suppliers to actually share with each other so they can actually know? One of the companies we know have actually guided this from the board is the Axel Johnson Group. And they have developed a little climate tool and action plan for their group in order to, which they follow from the board on the good board practice level. So they are looking at the scope 3 and suppliers, and their focus their discussion on both guidance and compliance when they are helping them. So in summary, ground the discussion, make sure you know what you know, bring in new voices, and if it's possible, get the chair, MD, of course, to lead. Educate together, including scenarios. So we talk a lot about climate scenarios. Most people actually don't work very much with scenarios. And it's good to just understand how it can impact and share good practices in the networks like Boardman and like Boards Impact Forum, and we are collaborating on this topic. Revisit your board agenda. Do you really have the processes and structure for evaluation? When you get to materiality, make sure you try to make a workshop and look at both risks and opportunities. And now, here's another interesting one. Most companies don't have a super good way of actually governing innovation, which will be much needed, as you can see, when we're going to do such a big transformation and transition. Revisit the value chain, see if you actually need to move a bit in your value chain in terms of what you're offering, and integrating it with ambitious goals. Revisit the KPIs and of course monitor regulation, but make sure you drive it from the business perspective. Motivate through role modeling and make sure that you exchange your insights, and then keep perfecting. So the thing that I think you are all here is to actually also share in networks. So join Boardman, join Boards Impact Forum. For Boards Impact Forum, do join as a member. I saw there was a lot of equity owners here. I invite you to become our partners and support us. It will be a very good way for you to actually impact your companies. Here you will find both this climate governance principles. You will find links on how to do this, and you find an entire little board toolkit that you can use. We have focused on actually getting a lot of things that facilitates for the chairs. So some of the latest things that we have is to facilitate a just transition and how to consider the entire nature perspective. March 1st, we're starting our next version of free online training that you can take. And we also recommend that you keep reading and keep engaging in that. That's all for me.